recognizes this guy, Usain Bolt, billed as the fastest man in the world at the moment. His current world record for 100 meters is 9.58 seconds, which has stood for 11 years. Here's another very fast individual, South African Akani Simbine, who has been able to run this year, 2020, 9:91 seconds, which was set in March. He had his eyes set on the Olympics, but obviously that's been postponed. So Tokyo at some point. His personal best, interestingly, is 9:89. Where does he get his energy from when he runs? Our energy, obviously, is chemical potential energy. You'll remember that from your grade 8 and 9 natural sciences curriculum. So chemical potential energy, which is stored energy, we then eat that, digest it, absorb the food, and break the molecules down even smaller, and we convert that energy that has been stored into kinetic energy and heat. And that process is known as respiration. Respiration, or more correctly termed cellular respiration, is not breathing. Please do not make that mistake. Respiration is not breathing. When we require energy, we require it for things like growth, physically getting more cells and every cell that we have increasing in size. In order to have more cells, you've obviously got to do cell division. We also use cell division to produce our reproductive cells, our gametes. Movement. Things like peristalsis, just moving the food from your mouth down into your stomach so that you can digest it, requires energy. Blinking, your heart pumping, writing, walking, all of these things require movement, which require muscles, and in order for muscles to function, they require energy. Active transport against a concentration gradient requires energy. When do we do this? Well, we've done the nutrition section. So the absorption of nutrients, for example, is often against a concentration gradient. But importantly, when your nerves are functioning, so when an electrical signal is sent via your nerve, that is sent because of active transport. So ions are shunted in and out of cells, and it's that shunting of ions in and out of cells against a concentration gradient that generates that electrical impulse that makes your nerves work. And that requires energy. So all metabolic biochemical reactions actually require energy. That energy is needed in order to be able to work, the scientific version of work, not the go out and get a job kind of work. And without that, we would not be able to survive. So think back to food chains and webs, which we did in grade 10, as well as in your grade 8 and 9 natural sciences curriculum. We know that they all start with the sun. That is where all of our energy ultimately comes from. Sun shines on our producers. The producers then convert that radiant energy from the sun via photosynthesis into glucose, which is stored as starch. In some cases, the energy can come via chemosynthesis. So, for example, your deep oceanic vents, you have bacteria there that do not see the sun ever, and instead they use the heat from the volcanoes and sulfur that is present in the water. And from that, they do chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis, but that's minority of cases. So for the majority of us, photosynthesis is where we get our energy from. That energy is then passed along the food chain, and obviously as the grasshopper eats the grass, it gets energy from the grass that it eats when the frog eats the grasshopper, etc., etc. So that glucose that is produced by the grass is the ultimate source of energy for all creatures on the earth. So what is cellular respiration? It's a series of chemical reactions that take place within our cells in which that glucose molecule is broken down, most often in the presence of oxygen. That's what's called a catabolic reaction. Catabolic, think catastrophe, breaking down. So glucose is broken down, catabolic, in the presence of oxygen. The result of that is that we produce carbon dioxide and water, as well as then releasing energy that can be used for the various processes that we've spoken about. That energy that is released is not just released, because if it was, you would burst into flames. Instead, that energy is captured and stored in a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate, meaning that it has 3 phosphate groups, and a phosphate group, if you don't remember, is phosphorus and oxygen, PO4. Adenosine is actually the building block of an amino acid. So it's a portion of an amino acid combined with 3 phosphate groups to make this molecule called ATP. All right, here are our 2 equations for cellular respiration. The first is the word equation and the second is the chemical equation. Remember, in an exam, if they ask for the word equation and you give even one of those words as a formula, so instead of water, if you wrote H2O, you would get no marks. So when they ask for the word equation, you may only use words. When they ask for the chemical equation, you may only use the chemical formulae. The exception obviously being the word energy, because there's no real chemical formula for energy at this point. All right, so glucose plus oxygen, in the presence of enzymes, is converted to carbon dioxide and water. And in the process, energy is released, both in the form of heat and of ATP. So where does this take place? Firstly, it takes place in all living cells. You remember I said to you that respiration is not breathing. Breathing takes place in the respiratory system, which is your lungs, your nasal passages, but respiration, cellular respiration, takes place in every living cell, whether it's a kidney or a toe or your scalp or your liver or your eyes. Every single living cell respires. The exception are your erythrocytes once they have left your bones. So your red blood cells are produced in your bone. While they're in your bone, they are respiring. They then die and leave your bone. At that point, they stop respiring. Cellular respiration mostly occurs inside your mitochondria. There is some steps, or there are a few steps in cellular respiration that occur in your cytoplasm, but the majority of cellular respiration takes place inside your mitochondria. And so obviously you would expect that in tissues where energy requirements or energy needs are huge, that you will find large numbers of mitochondria. For example, in your muscles, you find lots of mitochondria in your muscle cells. And the presence of those mitochondria and the high presence of blood providing oxygen to those mitochondria is what causes your muscles to be so red in color. Remember, respiration is not breathing. Okay, so let's have a look at those mitochondria. Notice that mitochondria is the plural word, mitochondrion is the singular. So as you can see, it's a sort of roughly oval-shaped organelle, double membrane, an inner and an outer membrane with an intermembranal space between them. What's interesting is that the inner membrane is highly folded. Now, in biology, whenever anything is folded, in the back of your head, you should be hearing the phrase, increased surface area for increased reactions. So this highly folded inner membrane, the folds are called cristae. They increase the surface area on which or across which your respiration can take place. The chemical equations, biochemical equations that make up respiration, they will take place across these inner membrane surfaces. The inside of your mitochondrion is made up of fluid, which we call the matrix, not like Neo the One, very different sort of matrix. Inside your mitochondria, you obviously have ribosomes as well, mitochondrial ribosomes, which are involved in making proteins that are required, as well as some mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondrial DNA we will talk about again in matric when we do DNA and when we talk about evolution. However, it's very, very different from the DNA that is in the rest of your cell, the DNA that's in your nucleus, for example. Very, very different sort of DNA. And the DNA is there in order to make sure that the processes that take place inside your mitochondria are efficient and that they run the way that they should. So it's there to control the reactions inside your mitochondria. When we look at a model of your mitochondrion, this is what it looks like, the 3D version on the left and the micrograph on the right. This micrograph comes from a TEM, a transmission electron microscope, and you can see quite clearly the ribosomes and the cristae, as well as the outer membrane. Just another micrograph of a mitochondrion. So how do organisms get energy if there's no oxygen? Is it possible? We said that respiration takes place in the presence of oxygen. If there's no oxygen, can they get the energy that they need? Can they break down the glucose? And the answer is yes, because there are in fact two types of respiration. There is aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. And we do both as human beings. Aerobic respiration is what we do in the presence of oxygen, and anaerobic respiration is what we do when there is no oxygen. When you wake up in the morning after a day of heavy exercise, your muscles will be tired and sore, and when you kind of stretch or walk or whatever, you can feel that ache and that pain in your muscle. That is the result of anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is exercising or walking or doing activity at such a rate that your blood can pump enough oxygen, or your heart can pump enough blood carrying oxygen to your muscles so that you can do aerobic respiration. So a nice gentle walk will allow your heart to pump hard enough and fast enough to continue to supply enough oxygen to your leg muscles so that you're only doing aerobic respiration. When you suddenly sprint off down the road, you might well discover that you're then into anaerobic respiration because your heart can't keep up with providing enough oxygen to your leg muscles, and so the next day you will then have pain in those muscles. So how does anaerobic respiration work? We know that glucose has 6 carbon molecules in it. What respiration does is it breaks down those 6 carbons in the one molecule, and it splits them up into 6 different molecules of 1 carbon each. And the way that it does this is in 3 different stages. The first stage is called glycolysis, not to be confused with glucagon, glycogen, and glucose. There are lots of GL words in life sciences, and you must make sure that you can spell all of them correctly. Glycolysis, lysis means to break down, glyco referring to glucose. So the 6 carbon molecule of glucose is split into 2, each of which has 3 carbons, and that process releases a small amount of energy. You don't need to know how much energy is released, but it is 2 ATP. The second phase is what's called Krebs cycle. In Krebs cycle, each half of the glucose molecule, so at the end of glycolysis we had 2 3-carbon compounds, each one of those is then broken down through a series of steps, releasing more energy. Again, 2 ATP, but you don't need to know the actual value. At the end of Krebs cycle, as that 3-carbon compound is broken down into 3 1-carbon compounds, a lot of hydrogen is released. And that hydrogen is then used in oxidative phosphorylation, big word. Oxidative in the presence of oxygen. Phosphorylation sounds like phosphorus, because what we're doing is we're adding a phosphate group. And so in oxidative phosphorylation, that hydrogen is used to create lots of ATP, 36 molecules in fact. In a little bit more detail. So glycolysis. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. We take our 6-carbon molecule, glucose, and we split that into 2 3-carbon compounds. And in the process, ATP is made. Notice glycolysis does not require oxygen. There's no oxygen in this process. Okay, so we make our 2 molecules of 3-carbon compound, and that 3-carbon compound is called pyruvic acid. Now, the pyruvic acid is going to go on into the next stage, into the Krebs cycle, but a few hydrogen atoms are produced, and they are very high energy. Okay, so our 2 pyruvic acids go off to Krebs cycle. In the Krebs cycle, we're just going to look at one of the pyruvic acid molecules, not both. It is a cycle in that you constantly wind up back at a 3-carbon compound. So it's carried out by enzymes, but it takes place in the mitochondrion. So the pyruvic acid that is produced in the cytoplasm moves across the mitochondrial membranes into the matrix in the mitochondria. So this is where oxygen is now required. And that oxygen, as it interacts with this pyruvic acid, is converted into carbon dioxide. So the pyruvic acid molecule, one carbon at a time, is removed from the pyruvic acid and added to the oxygen to give us CO2. Again, this process releases high energy hydrogen atoms, which are going to all be mopped up in the end by oxidative phosphorylation. The CO2 is then released into your bloodstream, and you exhale that CO2 from your lungs. All right, oxidative phosphorylation, just a reminder, oxidative meaning this process requires oxygen or has taken place in the presence of oxygen. Phosphorylation, the adding of phosphate groups. So this takes place on the cristae, the membranes of the mitochondrion, requires oxygen. All of the high energy hydrogen atoms from both glycolysis and Krebs cycle, they are mopped up by this process. And what happens to them is that they're passed along from one hydrogen acceptor to another. These hydrogen acceptors, they're actually enzymes that are present in the membrane of the cristae. So they're actually embedded in the cristae membrane. As they pass from one acceptor to another, the energy is released, and as a result, the hydrogen just becomes an ordinary hydrogen ion, and that additional energy is used to then add phosphates to a molecule called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. The deactivated hydrogen then combines with oxygen, and we get water produced from this process. This is how camels are able to store their water. They don't actually store water, they store fat, but a similar kind of process takes place. When they break down the fat that is stored, it's a hydrolysis reaction, and water is released as respiration occurs of that fat molecule. So, oxidative phosphorylation occurs across the membranes of the cristae in the mitochondrion. It mops up all the hydrogen that has been produced during both glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So all of those hydrogen ions, high energy hydrogen ions, they're sitting in the membrane space. And they then passed from one hydrogen acceptor to another. And those hydrogen acceptors are sitting on the inner membrane of the cristae. So as that hydrogen is then passed from one hydrogen acceptor to the next, ADP is phosphorylated to form ATP. And again, and again. And that keeps happening until the hydrogen is just ordinary hydrogen again, at which point it then combines with oxygen to form water. That water will be used by cells either as part of their cytoplasm, or if there is an excess of water, that will then be filtered out by the kidneys into your urine. You will sweat it out, or you can get rid of it from your breath. So to sum up, aerobic respiration. The first process is glycolysis, in which glucose is converted to pyruvic acid and some ATP is made. That takes place outside of the mitochondrion. The pyruvic acid molecules are then moved into the mitochondrion, and in the mitochondrion the Krebs cycle occurs, where that carbon compound is broken down into carbon dioxide and some ATP is made. In both of those processes, lots of hydrogen is produced. That hydrogen is then passed to an electron transport system in which oxidative phosphorylation will take place. So as the hydrogen is passed from one hydrogen acceptor to another, lots of ATP is going to be made. Oxygen is required for the electron transport system and for the Krebs cycle. Water is produced as a result of oxidative phosphorylation.